Okay, so that's happening.
Yep, super.
And let me just stop it.
And I'll hand over to Professor John Hanley, who is going to formally introduce Professor Ian Rotherham, our guest speaker for this evening. Over to you, John. John, can you unmute?
Okay, so it's a huge pleasure. You hear that okay?
Thank you, John. That's
pleasure
good.
for me to introduce Professor Ian Rotherham, who is very much a kindred spirit, I think. Ian is now an emeritus professor in the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre at Sheffield Hallam University. That sounds very interesting in itself, so we might want to ask about that at the end. Before that, for many years, Ian was Professor of Environmental Geography at Sheffield Hallam. Now, most science is done in kind of watertight compartments within narrowly defined specialisms, and we call that the multidisciplinary approach. There are a few people, and Ian is one of these, who are able to work across these disciplinary boundaries, working from physical science at the one end of the scale right across into the arts and humanities. And this interdisciplinary approach, when people can do it, is immensely valuable. For example, if we think about what we hope is going to be the forthcoming restoration of our own cutover peat bog at Lindow Moss, that could well be something that's carried out in a closed off, narrowly defined way by eco-nerds. But there's an alternative way of doing that, which would engage with the community and which would recognize the enormously important cultural history and archaeology of this area. And if it's done in that kind of a way, if it's done in a much more inclusive way and a way with that greater perspective, the whole thing would be so much more valuable and the legacy would be incredible. Ian is someone who has consistently worked across boundaries. He has written several books, book chapters, academic articles in ecology, environmental studies, and environmental history. And he has over 3,000 formal citations of his work. In 2009, he published a lovely little book called Peat and Peat Cutting. And he followed that in 2020 with this very important book called Peatlands, which is a major text which takes a global perspective. Now that's important because although peatlands cover just 2.84% of the Earth's terrestrial and freshwater surface, that's the surface of the Earth excluding the oceans, they capture and lock away more carbon dioxide than annually than all the other vegetation put together. So that is really significant and of such great importance in this week and in our Festival of Nature when we're focused on COP26 and saving the planet. So over to Ian.
Okay, John.
Yep.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm just trying to hide the toolbar.
It's okay, Ian. We can't see the tool.
Okay, that's fine. I think that's got rid of it. Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you very, very much for the invitation. And thank you for that very generous introduction, John. What I want to do is take a slightly oblique look at peat bogs and peatlands, because a lot of the other stuff I'm sure you are very, very familiar with. And it is a surprisingly broad, interesting, fascinating subject. So I want to focus on some aspects which I think may be a little bit new to you. And I've called it Lost in the Bog, Peatlands Past, Present and Future. I have, I think, some problems with things that I'm passionate about. Two of my favourite things, I used to run the British Ecological Society's Peatlands Research Group, which is a bunch of enthusiasts with people like Simon Capehorn, who you know locally. But two things that I'm really passionate about. One is bogs, and the other is scrub. And I don't think the language is there on my side. I think, you know, these are problems in the way that they're perceived. They're kind of the Cinderellas of the conservation movement. So what I want to do is introduce various aspects of peat bogs and talk through some of the issues and thoughts and ideas. I'm going to look at it, as John said, from a multi-topical point of view, if you like. I try to work across boundaries, which sometimes gets you into very deep water or peat, as the case may be. But it's what fascinates me. If I find a new area of research, then it's a bit like a kid in a sweet shop, you know, with your nose pressed up against the glass. You know, I find it absolutely riveting and fascinating. So I started with an interest in peat bogs back in the 1970s, being amazed by sphagnum mosses, not knowing how to identify them, because at that time it was very, very difficult. There weren't many handy guides or anything, but being fascinated by these habitats. And then by the 1980s, getting involved in the peat campaign to try to stop the hugely damaging removal of peat bogs for commercial enterprise. And that conflict, that battle goes on still. And I'll mention that right at the end, because you can all help me a little bit. I took early retirement from Hallam and became an emeritus professor this last summer. And I finally took up Twitter, which I'd avoided like the plague for many, many years. I've got a blog that I do, but I hadn't done Twitter. And one of my colleagues had kept saying, you must do Twitter, you must do it. And I've done it. And it's actually really very, very useful and a very powerful tool for getting stuff to a lot of people. But something I have learned very quickly is that the way for Twitter to be most effective is to get lots of people to like what you've tweeted and to forward or to retweet your tweet. So there will be some stuff going out in the next couple of months on peat bogs. And I would really appreciate as many people as possible retweeting my tweets. A colleague on Thorn Moors from the Thorn Hadfield Conservation Forum did a tweet earlier this week, and I'd asked her to do it, and that's gone viral, about present day commercial peat operations. And I followed that up about really based on an article in The Guardian about government agencies still using horticultural peat. Forestry Commission still use it. It's appalling. So I could do with some help, and I'll mention that right at the end because that is really important to me. So, that's better. Okay, why are we interested? Well, this view might be familiar to some of you. It's not a great picture, but the original photograph is very old, not in desperately good nick, but that is the trig point on top of Kinder Scout. And that's how it looked. And that's pretty much how it looked by the 1970s, 1980s. It's completely shot. This upland blanket mire, eroded, degraded, hemorrhaging carbon into the atmosphere, and also eroding peat into the surrounding watercourses and of course filling up the water supply reservoirs, which is one of the reasons for the success of moors for the future, is that business has been prepared to actually work with the conservation bodies to reinstate these bogs, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because it costs them millions of pounds a year to clean out the peat colour from your bathwater and drinking water. Because although it doesn't actually do you any harm, so I'm told, the paying public get very upset about the water coming out of their tap a rather brown sludgy colour. I did once do a bit of work at Moor House in the North Pennines. It was one of the major global biodiversity research stations, and at the centre there, supposedly if you had a bath you would come out looking like you hadn't had a bath because of the peat acid. It's a bit like having a bath in a tea bag. So what we've got here, degraded upland mires, blanket peats, kinder scout, massive erosion. But what we've also got is the lowlands. This is a typical lowland situation. It's a cut over bog at Mid Hartfield in Paisley in Scotland. And you can see in that landscape, you can see the linear marks in the fields, probably of drains and maybe of older peat cuts. Then you can see part of the site, which is the uncut peatland over here, and the cut over mire there. This has been a story in the lowlands. So, you know, it's a huge, huge issue. And one of the things of the multidisciplinary work is actually raising questions and indeed answering questions that you didn't know were there. These peat bogs, contrary to a lot of popular opinion, which is that these are kind of wastelands, if you look at old maps, they speak volumes, because they're often mapped for landowners in the 1800s, and they are called on the maps waste. Thorn Moors, massive lowland peat complex up to the 1700s, was then called Thorn Waste. So it's basically of little use to the landowner, but didn't mean it wasn't of use to local people. So we'll come on to that, because these peat bogs provided fuel. And certainly in what we're not supposed to call the Little Ice Age, but a very cold period from about the 1300s through to the 1800s, if you hadn't got fuel, then you had a great chance of dying of cold. So that was an issue. And I became fascinated, having been involved in setting up the peat campaign locally and then nationally. I also then got involved and interested, fascinated by the cultural history of these peat bogs. And people like that character there with his pipe stood in front of a peat stack. So I really got very, very interested in that. So peatlands are quite a broad range of habitat types, environments. I'm not going to go into great detail because it's too complicated. I'm sure most of you know a lot of it already. But in the lowlands, we tend to get expansive, sometimes raised bogs, raised mires in lowland, often floodplain areas. And in the uplands, we get extensive blanket mires where the conditions are just so wet that vegetation doesn't fully decompose. And then also, not often in the uplands, but occasionally and much more prevalent in the lowlands, you will get extensive fens. And one of the things to bear in mind is that these habitats, these peatlands, fens, bogs, mires, were far more extensive historically than anybody, I think, has actually realised. And there are implications of that. But the reason you get a peatland is that for some reason, the drainage is impeded, the site becomes wet, and vegetation doesn't decompose. Now, our peatlands are often, the fenlands are often peat from sedge and from reed. In the bogs, as such, they're largely sphagnum mosses. But if you go into, say, the tropics and other areas, you've got a whole different set of species producing the organic biomass that doesn't decompose. So you can get peatlands formed with different species for different reasons. But essentially, waterlogging stops air and oxygen getting to the organic matter, and the organic matter does not break down completely. Some of the tropical peats are 8,000 to 10,000 years old. So we should bear that in mind when you see them burning as they do in Indonesia and Malaysia and the Amazon. So for us, for a peat bog, this is the peat builder, the bog builder, the Sphagnum Mosses. And it's only in recent years that we've actually had easy to access guides to identify the different species. It's actually been quite problematic and troublesome until fairly recently. If you go onto my website, and there are details at the end, and I've circulated information on this, there is an online sphagnum identification guide that you can access, and it takes you from a complete beginner to quite advanced, but with a focus really on the Peat District and surrounding areas. So if you want an easy access guide to Sphagnum Mosses, then that's the one to go for. This is Ringinglow Bog. There's not many major cities in the country that actually have a bog in the city boundary. This is Ringinglow. When I was Sheffield City Ecologist, this was part of my domain, so I was very excited, and I managed to get quite large areas of it protected from being drained and ploughed up, which is what our farm estates manager wanted to do at the time. The argument being, I mean, actually, I talked him round after a while. We went up and he ranted and raved at me about, don't you know that people are starving? I can turn this into farmland, blah, 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 blah. And at the end of the day, we said, well, how much do you need for a nature reserve? What can I do? Blah, blah. So we kind of reached an agreement on this. But these are the sorts of landscapes that historically have been removed. And this is also badly affected by air pollution. So it was written off by ecologists at Sheffield University in the early 1980s as being a sphagnum desert. The whole Peat District was a sphagnum desert, and Ringinglow was ecologically wrecked. Now, there's a fantastic project called Moors for the Future, which is restoring peat bogs in the Dart Peak and the northern area. This is on one of the outliers of the Dart Peak between Sheffield and the Central Peat District. And the amazing thing is it's recovering dramatically, simply being left alone. It's not that the air pollution has dropped. We've stopped any further drainage, but there's been no active blocking of drains. And we've reduced the sheep numbers on the site. And it's been fantastic. The result is this. We've got sundews over huge areas, sphagnum coming back. I think we've got, at the last count, about 10 or 12 species of sphagnum, including some of the bog builders, which are starting to recolonize. And it's been absolutely brilliant. And it's not required any active intervention. This last year, we had huge amounts of bog asphodel. And this is the upland, it's like a little yellow lily flower. It's a gorgeous little thing of peat bogs. Its Latin name is ossifragram, which means bone breaker. Because if farmers let their sheep into a wet peat bog, they get foot rot. So the Latin name reflects what this plant will do to your stock. But that hasn't stopped farmers in the past grazing these areas. And Ringinglow itself was particularly badly affected. Some of you may be old enough to remember when the North Sea gas pipelines were put through, and one of them went straight through the middle of Ringinglow Bog. I was told that they lost a hymac in the bog. And I remember seeing photographs of this thing sinking in. Whether it went all the way or whether it got dragged out, I do not know. But the consequence was they cut a drain through the middle of the bog, and a vast area of it drained as a consequence. And the bog rosemary, the Andromeda, was never seen again. And I think it was the draining of the bog, but particularly the draining allowed sheep onto the bog, and sheep love bog Andromeda. I knew someone who had a nursery where they had a lot of these plants, and the fence got knocked down one winter, and the sheep got in and they ate all the bog Andromeda. So we know from an experimental point of view that sheep love to eat this. We refound this about 5 years ago doing a sphagnum workshop, and we looked down, having searched for this plant throughout the Peat District for many decades and not found it. And we were doing something else and looked down and thought, whoa, we're still on some bog Andromeda in flower. And this last year, it spread enormously. It's absolutely brilliant. So there's a moral here that if we can cut down the pollution, if we can hold back the water, if we can moderate the intensive grazing, some of these sites will recover by themselves. The bog builders, the water holding mosses, the sphagnum mosses. And if you get a chance, have a look at either my blog or my website, my research website, and there's a number of posters we did about the use of sphagnum moss in wartime to bind wounds for surgery. I haven't got time today to go into that, but it is a really interesting thing which we discovered and did a lot of work on, and we found people's families whose grandmothers had been out collecting moss for the war effort. This was pre-antibiotics in the First War, particularly sphagnum moss was hugely important in dealing with catastrophic injuries sustained on the Western Front particularly. In the Second World War, the royal princesses at Balmoral are recorded as going out and gathering sphagnum moss for the war effort. We did try to get a message to Queen Elizabeth to ask if she remembered it, but we couldn't get past her private secretary, unfortunately. So this is Sphagnum cuspidatum. This is a wet sphagnum, and it grows from semi-amphibious habitats into deep water. And it is incredibly variable in form. And the general description is that it looks like drowned kittens. So I love cats. So anyone out there, I'm sorry, I apologize for that, but that is a standard description for identification, that it looks like a bunch of kittens that have been thrown into a pool of water. So in the lowlands particularly, we get extensive reed fen. And often when you're restoring a cut over peat bog, this is one of the main habitats that comes back. What you don't get immediately is a raised bog. You don't go suddenly from a cut over peat bog to what it was maybe 200-300 years ago. And often you're going to get areas of fen establishing. If in 500 years time you've got a peat bog back, then that's great. And essentially what you have to do to restore these big cutover areas is a slowly approach where you raise the water a bit at a time. If you simply flood it, you get a lake and vegetation doesn't establish. So what you have to do is, and it's labor intensive and therefore expensive, you have to wet it a little at a time to allow the sphagnum to develop, to allow it to grow on. But of course, the other problem that we've got is that our landscape, our wider environment, is horribly polluted with nitrogen from all sorts of things that we do, from farming fertilizer to power stations and petrol-driven cars, for example. So we've released huge amounts of nitrogen into the atmosphere, and that has an impact. So we need to think about what is likely, what is possible. But we have this complex of bogs, fens, mires, and other peatlands. That's Thorn Moors near where I live. This is Doncaster. And that is what is still a 7 by 4 miles wetland. And we've got things like common cranes got there by themselves, because if they're flying at 1,000 feet, they can see this from a long way away. I've even had people report to me cranes flying over Sheffield, probably the first time for about 400 years, because when they were last here, I think we ate them. But we've now got lots of cranes re-establishing, and they are breeding on the Thorn Moors complex. But when this was before the peat industry affected it, this would have been a vast multi-domed peat bog extending over many miles in the centre of what was an extensive fenland, something like 2,000 to 3,000 square kilometres of wetland. And the central parts of this were probably 20 to 30 feet deep in peat, absolutely phenomenal. We've never seen a site like that, and we never will see it in our lifetimes, unfortunately. What we've got now is a fantastic landscape, really brilliant. It's, I think, the biggest wetland restoration project in Western Europe. But peat has an interesting cultural history. This is the 1947 year, was that year of terrible snows and terrible floods. This is peat fuel being harvested on the Isle of Lewis in the Western Isles. And they also there had a peat chemical works. We had one at Ringing Low Bog, and I've even talked to the descendants of the family that ran that in the late 1800s. And we had a peat works, a chemical works on Thorn Moors called the Paraffin Works. And before the widespread advent of petrochemicals, peat was being distilled to make organic compounds. But just look at the scale of that utilization. And of course, you all know about bog bodies, and the archaeologists can tell us a huge amount of information about what these imply. This is the body of a 14-year-old girl executed deliberately. It's from northern Germany. It's about 2,000 years old. And the archaeologists think because there was another body close by of an older male, and they think there was some sort of unacceptable relationship between the two, and they were both ceremonially dispatched. And the evidence is there in the bog. And part of the interest in early cultures in the healing qualities of peat bogs was a realization that bodies and other materials put into the peat remained intact and didn't degrade. So there's an awareness that, or a belief from that, that the peat and the water of a peat bog might have healing and therapeutic qualities. But as I say here, really what looks like a terribly sad incident. And most of the bog bodies found now turn out to be ceremonially executed. Something else I got very interested in when I was writing my little book on peat and peat cutting, I picked up, and I've done a lot of research on this, the idea of peat bathing, peat for health. So not the sphagnum for injuries, but peat. And peat and hot mud were viewed as healing right the way back to the Roman period and possibly earlier. And again, this has to be put in a context of people dealing with diseases without understanding anything about bacteria, viruses, germs, or whatever, and with very few treatments available. And they found that hot bathing in peat or hot mud, sulfurous mud, could be curative. So this became really a very fashionable thing to do. And in the Victorian period in particular, it became hugely popular, and it's still quite widely used in the United States. It's still quite widely used in Eastern Europe. In a lot of the old former Eastern Bloc countries, the government used to pay for you to have something like 2 or 3 weeks at a peat spa every summer, because they realized that it actually provided good health and healthcare. And there's some evidence that the chemistry of these materials did have a therapeutic quality. The ultimate, and this did get quite interesting reviews when I put it in my little book on peat and peat cutting, the ultimate was in the mid-Victorian period. I've got adverts for German peat spas, because I do think this is a particularly Germanic thing rather than a British thing. You could have a hot peat bath and you could be Faradized. That was where they passed an electric current through you. This was the early days of electricity generation. They didn't really understand the level of the current, and the technician administering this used to have to test it on himself, and quite a few of them killed themselves accidentally before applying it to the patient. And the other one was, and this I think is a particularly non-British thing, you could have a hot peat enema where the sun doesn't shine. So that caused quite a lot of interest when I explained that in the little book. And it's on our doorstep, one of England's only peat spas. There was one at Harrogate, and there was one at Buxton. There's a peat moor bath at Buxton, and this is the Turberry, the peat cutting site up on the hills above Buxton. But the peat bogs are a global phenomenon, as I say, and what's forming the peat varies depending where you are in the world. But these are hugely, hugely important resources, massively important in biodiversity, massively important for the communities. A lot of the tropical peat areas have indigenous peoples who are being deliberately exterminated by some governments. And they're also hugely important in climate mitigation. So I want to go very quickly through some ideas about peat usage, a global issue. That's my little book, Peat and Peat Cutting. And one of the things is, from Yorkshire to the Orkneys, you find peat being used in really places that you did not know. Peat fires, really important. I've got descriptions of peat fire in the Snake Inn on a three-legged stove, and and it sounds like something from Sutherlandshire in the late 1800s. And a lot of old pubs in the Peat District, when you look at the fire, my local is the Grouse at Froggatt. When you look at the fireplace and take out all the modern trancliments, it's a peat fire on a peat hearth, on a slab. And the more we look, the more evidence we found. The New Forest, many of you will have been to the New Forest. I hope you noticed the extensive turberies. You can go into the local history museum at, I think it's Lyndhurst, and you can actually see some of the tickets that were issued for people's rights to cut peat on these turberies. That's where you cut your peat fuel. And there, about 1900, a man actually cutting peat and putting it in a cart. And I've talked to people that used to burn peat in these landscapes. And huge areas of the New Forest are cut over peat turberies, bits of bogs. This is in Scandinavia, where again, there's a huge interest in peat fuel and peat harvesting. And they're an expert looking at the quality of the drying peat bricks. So from Uppsala to Chicago, there the guys in Chicago found a peat resource. I think this is 1920s, and the peat was there free for the taking, and people go and dig it up. Hugely important. If you haven't got much money, if you've got limited technology, and it may be free to take. It was also hugely important as peat fuel in Holland, for example, post-war. The golden age of Holland in medieval times was built on peat fuel. That powered the Dutch Industrial Revolution, the Dutch Economic Revolution. Canada's peat bogs. I talked to colleagues in North America, very eminent environmental historians, and they say, oh, well, we never had any peat. Peat bogs, particularly down the east coast of the USA, or there was no history of peat cutting. And I've now got a lot of volumes from the 1800s through into the 1900s explaining about the peat resources and how to exploit them. They were hugely, hugely important. And in North America, this really began in the late 1800s, early 1900s, with things like coal miners' strikes in New York State, meaning that, for example, the coal supply to Canada was cut off. And Canada can be very, very cold in winter. So they suddenly had to look for fuel elsewhere in the landscape. And the answer was peat. And there's a whole series of volumes, government volumes, saying how to exploit the resources of peat in different areas. And this kicked in very much in the First World War, because again, energy supplies were cut, energy was low. And again, in the Second World War, it was very, very important. And our attitudes to these landscapes are really interesting. This is, I don't know if I pronounced this correctly, this is in Cumberland, but it looks like Spade Adam. I'm sure there must be a local name, a local way of pronouncing that, so I apologize. If anybody does know, then let me know. This is Spade Adam Waste near Carlisle, 1962. And the use of a peat bog at that time was to build a site for the Blue Streak missile. If anyone remembers the Blue Streak. And you can see all this cut over landscape here. That looks like that's been drained for possibly forestry planting, and that huge extensive peatland. So what do? We stick a huge military base on it. But peat has been very, very important for industry, for economies. Peat moss for gardens, peat fibre for thermal and hygienic clothing. I've got loads of adverts now for buying peat underwear. I've got adverts for expos in the 1800s and early 1900s, and you could have your curtains made out of peat. You could have your house made out of peat blocks. You could have your carpets, paper, postcards. I've got lots of Irish postcards made on peat paper. The thing that we remember peat for is either peat fuel or peat moss for gardens. And peat moss for gardens is a relatively late comer to the game of using peat. It was only really the fact that peat was almost like a waste product. And then someone realized that you could use it as a soil conditioner. And the modern peat industry was based on that, to disastrous effect, absolutely catastrophic effect. The main use, apart from peat fuel historically, was as animal bedding for horses. And huge amounts of peat were shipped out to the Western Front in the First World War for the stabling of horses that were involved in the military effort. And those of you who have seen the film War Horse will probably notice that they don't mention peat an awful lot. I don't know why. For me, it's the most, it's the most fascinating thing. We've got records of huge amounts of peat being taken from thorn moors and some of the other peat mosses and shipped out. It was also used to power the emerging towns and cities across England and Scotland, particularly because up to about the 1920s, they were largely powered by animal power. Animals needed stabling, and you stable them in peat moss litter. And how do we know all this? Well, we can find evidence from things like the archives. This is an advert for an importer of German peat moss and hoof stuffing. I still haven't worked out what hoof stuffing is, but I am determined to find out. But you could buy bales of German peat moss and pails of hoof stuffing or boxes of hoof stuffing. We can also look at archives for things like enclosure awards. I'll not bore you with the details, but these are, because these have always got loads and loads of legalistic bits, hiding the really interesting stuff. But this is, the peat was often on the common, and the commons were being actively enclosed from the 16 and 1700s through into the mid 1800s. And this was an act for enclosing Great Crosby Marsh in the manor of Great Crosby and the parish of Sefton in the county of Lancaster. And it will go into all the detail of who's doing it, why, what the compensation is, what rights are given to the people. Because quite often when you did this, you left an area of land as fuel allotments for the upkeep of the poor. Because then, like now, no one wanted to pay for the poor, and it fell on the local parish. So if you lost your common, which is where the poor could often subsist, you ended up having to pay for them, and nobody wanted that. So you left areas which are now identified as fuel allotments, and they can be absolutely fascinating in the landscape. But there's also, this is a notice under the Commons Act of 1876, and this was a special report as to the enclosure of Mungersdale Low Common in Cumberland. And it talks about who's wanting to do it, who's wanting it not to be done. And these are conflict situations between the different actors, the different stakeholders. And we can find all that sort of information. This sort of information led me to two books, The Lost Fens, England's Greatest Ecological Disaster, which one or two of my colleagues in Lincolnshire, because it's talking about the drainage of the East England fens, the Northern Fen, which is North Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, about 2,000 to 3,000 square kilometres, and the Southern Fen of about 5,000 square kilometres, which is the East Anglian and South Lincolnshire fens. It didn't mean Lincolnshire's no good for wildlife, it just means it used to be much, much better. And then the other one that captured people's imagination was Yorkshire's Forgotten Fenlands, because as my good friend Chris Smout wrote, the fens of Northern England have largely evaporated from the corporate memory. We've just forgotten they were ever there. So the second part is to look at the peat campaign. We began in the 1980s, Thorn Moors and two landmark conferences at Doncaster Museum and at Sheffield University, which led to almost now the cessation of peat cutting, industrial peat cutting in Britain. It is still happening in some places, which I'll mention at the end, but we have made a lot of progress. Those, incidentally, are Russian peat harvesters in the 1960s. Those are the big boys. And I can still remember similar sort of machines carving up peat mosses in Ireland, and David Bellamy, the late David Bellamy, standing in front of these huge peat harvesters on this hillside as these massive machines came towards him. And I think that was the tipping point for getting me really into campaigning about peat bogs. But peat has been hugely important for ordinary people, which we'll talk about, but Also industrial extraction on a massive, massive scale. I mean, look at that picture of Bavaria down there, 1932. It's a huge peat cut landscape. But digging peat for gardens, digging peat for horse litter, digging peat for chemical extraction. And the consequence, this is Milwaukee in the USA. And one of the consequences is that when you drain a peat bog to cut it, to exploit it, you dry it out and you've got very flammable material. In this case, the thing just burned. When they reclaimed much of the Everglades in the early part of the 20th century, one of the consequences was not only catastrophic flooding in some areas and salination because seawater crept under the coastal zone into the water supply, but also the drained landscape just burnt, and it burnt for months. Absolutely horrific. They had no idea what they were doing, and it caused an absolute disaster. And then this is what we've done. This is the Somerset levels. One of the three big peat, lowland peat areas, the Humberhead levels, the Cambridgeshire Fens, the East Anglian Fens, and the Somerset levels. And I actually met the man here, a Mr. Sweet, very elderly. I think he may still be alive, but he actually established an independent peat museum. And his family had owned one of the peat moors, and he had been on TV and on the front page of national newspapers because they lynched a mock-up of one of the Nature Conservancy Council officers, someone who I later got to know, and they lynched him when they were trying to stop the peat cutting on the Somerset levels. And I got to talk to this chap. We had a really fascinating talk, and he said, look, we understood that we couldn't carry on forever, but we just felt our livelihood was being taken from us, our heritage, our culture was being taken from us, but we could not, and you can see why with this, we couldn't carry on doing this. Something else to bear in mind when you are thinking about peat and peat bogs, the importance in the 1700s and 1800s, particularly with the backdrop of the threat of starvation, the importance of land improvement. Now, when you say land improvement, for me as an ecologist, that means land destruction, it means ecological destruction. For the Victorians and before, it meant turning barren wasteland into productive landscape. And one of the people behind this was a man called Joseph Elkington. And I have been in touch with his descendants because there is a little society that remembers his name. And his approach, his novel approach to draining peat bogs was captured in this account by John Johnston in the early 1800s, an account of the mode of draining land, according to the system practiced by Mr. Joseph Elkington. This is the second edition. Elkington was awarded a pension of something like £1,000 from Parliament for his work, because this was considered so important. £1,000 in the 1700s is a huge amount of money. That was the value placed on novel ways of draining. I think it's in my little book on peat and peat cutting as well. The Victorians also organised draining contests that everybody would turn out and watch people cutting a straight ditch. This is before computer games and modern television, of course. But these were huge public entertainment events. The Irish had peat cutting contests, huge national peat cutting contests, where large Irishmen would dig out as much peat as they could in a race against each other. This is a hugely important resource, massively important across the countryside. This is peat cutting in Scotland there. Look at the little croft with the little farmhouse with the smoke, peat smoke coming out, and look at the peat stacks and the people carting and drying and cutting. There are also some other aspects of peatlands, because peatlands are hugely important in the theatre of war. And this is something that I've written about with a book called War and Peat, with a nod to Tolstoy. And this is just one example. This is the Solway Mosses between England and Scotland. But peat bogs are strategically significant in the landscape. And we wanted to look at both the importance of peat bogs and wetlands in warfare, but also the impact of warfare on the wetlands, which is catastrophic. So here we have the Battle of Solway Moss, right on the Solway Firth, where 8 15,000 Scots troops were routed by 3,000 English. And we write about this in War and Peat and various other battles, such as Flodden Field and things like that, which again turned on the fact that the Scots didn't realise that there was a peat bog halfway down the hill, and they marched into it and sank and were then slaughtered by the English. But at Solway, what happened was that the vanguard of the English arrived with about 500 horsemen in pitch black, and they had a slightly headstrong leader who basically got ahead of the rest of the army, came on the Scottish camp and went into full battle mode. The Scots thought the entire English army had arrived, and they scattered and ran out into the Solway moss in pitch black. And I have to say, if you're wearing armour and you go onto a peat bog, it's a pretty unpleasant way to die. You sink in quite quickly. And they were completely annihilated by a far inferior force. There's another one. This is just touching on a few examples, hopefully to whet your appetite a little bit. In Holland, they talk about the famous turf ship of Breda in 1590, which was the Dutch equivalent of a Trojan horse. And this is the height of the Catholic and Spanish-Dutch wars, the Catholic-Protestant conflicts. And the walled city was being held. So they put a peat barge outside with a gift of peat turf to keep the inhabitants safe and warm in the winter. And remarkably, the people in the city opened it up and took it in. And of course, under the peat in the barge were soldiers who were able to then get out and open the gate, and the city was taken. The other examples, just again, a few quick examples. The Battle of the Somme in the First World War it's basically in a huge great peat bog. That's why you see the pictures of it being so wet, and why lots of the troops in the trenches had things like foot rot, which is a particularly unpleasant medical condition. But peat was important both as fuel in conflict times, but also as a feature in the landscape. And what happened in Holland, with peat moss for binding wounds and for surgical appliances. Or applications. In the Second World War, the Dutch flooded the polders to halt the Nazi advance, and then the Nazis struck back after Holland fell, and they broke the sluices and broke the dikes and flooded the farming landscape. So huge numbers of Dutch people starved. That was a sort of punitive response, if you like. So I hope that sort of set the scene a little bit to indicate the importance of these features, which most people just ignore. That's Stirling Castle, incidentally, and it was said that whoever controlled Stirling Castle controlled Scotland. It's the Firth and it's Flanders moss. And if you control the crossing, as the English found out at the Battle of Stirling Bridge and the Battle of Bannockburn, then you controlled Scotland. Peat bogs have been hugely, hugely important. So I was going to take a 5-minute break there, and then we'll come back to look at some of the other aspects of the social and industrial history and heritage. But you can see in the picture the problems that peat and mud caused for any sort of conflict. This is Belgium, and you can see the scene, a typical scene in the bogs of Belgium when the rainy season transforms the fields and roads into veritable quagmires. Thank you very much.
Ian,
So we'll
thank
give it
you,
5
thank
minutes.
you very much. We'll take a well-earned break now. If you'd like to stop screen sharing for the moment, then we can okay. Pippa, are you there?
You're on mute, Pippa.
Hello.
Oh, Pippa, now, whilst Ian takes a break,
Yeah.
Ian, are you able to just exit the screen share for a moment?
I'm trying to. I can't see the controls on here because I think because I put them to float.
Right. Well, if everybody's on speaker view anyway, they'll see who's who's speaking. And I think the next voice we'd like to hear, Pippa, is yours. Pippa, how are we doing for questions? Have we got anything that we would like to ask Ian at this point that he might come back on in the second half?
Well, we've got the question he doesn't know the answer to, which is how do you pronounce Spade-Adam? And Anna thinks it's Spid-Adam.
Spid-Adam, oh, right.
Spade-Adam is the correct pronunciation. It's still a military facility. So there you are. We've got one for Spid-Adam and one for Spade-Adam. So I don't know if anybody else has got any options there. Or if either Anna or Vince would like to give us the evidence for their decision that it's Spid-Adam or Spade-Adam.
Well, certainly the only reason I think it's Spade-Adam is because I know a few guys in the RAF who are familiar with that as a military facility, and that's what they call it. Now, they may be wrong. I don't know.
No, that's great. That's what I called it, Spade-Adam.
So that's all we've got in terms of questions so far. So
Well,
anyone else who's got questions coming in, please put them up there.
And do please, in the meanwhile, keep yourselves muted, but use the chat facility to fire the questions off, ideally addressed to Pippa, but if it comes to all, I'm sure Pippa will edit it out. One of the things that's impressed me so far is the range, the scope, the geographical spread. I hadn't quite appreciated, perhaps because my life has been so Wilmslow centric, that we could come across the very different peats in different territories. I've enjoyed various mud type treatments in Germany, but I've never actually been offered a peat mud bath. The ones I've had were embarrassing enough, so I don't think I'd go down that route. Now, what about our Wilmslow moss? There's a question coming in from Jill. Pippa, if you want to.
Oh yes. Do any Indigenous people still use sphagnum moss for babies' nappies? Well, unless anyone can answer that, that's a fascinating one.
I think we'll leave that on the inbox for Ian to get back to, Pippa, if we can.
Yeah. And then another one, are there still peat-fired power stations in the Republic of Ireland? So we can come back to those.
A couple of technical points there. I think the majority of our audience tonight will have a degree of familiarity with our own Lindo moss, and will have seen what's happened over the last 40 years in particular. So it's good to hear Ian's experience of places elsewhere. And I just wonder how many of us realise that when we're driving into Sheffield, just how much peat there is as we go over the moors. I think that's really interesting.
Well, I spent my early childhood in Sheffield, and our school bus was on the road, or it was on Ringing Low Road, and I had no idea that Ringing Low is a peat bog, so I have to go back and revisit it, I think, and try and get the bus.
Yes, it is. So there was something missing in your education then, Pippa.
There was, yeah.
Well, we'll just give Ian a minute or two to come back to his seat. Does anyone want to put their hand up and add to the discussion? But don't unmute yourself. Just let's see if anyone's putting a hand up. We've got a jolly good turnout. We've got 69 screens open. And when you consider that quite a few screens are 2 people, Vince again, would you like to come back again, Vince? Unmute.
Oh, well, Vince is telling us that he went via Ringinglow Road, and it was very scenic with a bog. So
Right.
it's definitely something on my next day out list.
Yeah, I found it by accident because I found the traffic getting into Sheffield was absolutely appalling. And I had a look on the Ordnance Survey map and found this Ringinglow Road that seemed to cut out most of it. And it was not only quicker, but it was a far more scenic way of getting into Sheffield.
Fantastic.
And there was, as a further point of interest, not really that relevant to what we're talking about, but there was a turf burning locomotive was developed in the 1950s. It was never very successful. Turf, of course, being the Irish term for peat, but it didn't work very well for the railways, that was.
John, are you nearly ready to restart?
Ian.
Yeah,
Ian,
Yeah.
Ian, so Ian, are you ready now to?
yeah, I think so.
Well, if you'd like to take over again, then we'll look forward to continuing your talk, please. And I think your screen sharing will just work if you want to go perhaps back onto full screen.
That's what I'm hoping, yes. I think I may have to go out and come back in again. I'm not sure. I'm struggling to see how to.
Ian, I don't know whether you
Yeah.
could press slideshow and resume at that slide.
Just bear with me.
Lata, do you want to add a technical comment on restarting the PowerPoint?
I think that may be.
You can probably just put it into presentation mode in the bottom right hand corner of the
Can you see-
PowerPoint. There you go.
Can you now see that?
Yes,
Yes.
thank you.
Yeah, that's okay, is it?
Yes.
It is.
Okay, that's good. And you can hear me okay?
We can, thank you, John. Ian, thank you.
Okay, very good, thank you. Right, I want to drill a bit more into detail about industrial consumption and also about domestic usage. And I say, hopefully some of this will be new to a lot of you. There's a huge amount of information if we drill down at different sites and look at archives, etc. But just one example is a set of diaries which are sent between Cumbria and Germany and ending in 1577. And these were accounts of German miners in Cumbria. And obviously Cumbria was a very famous area for mining metals of national importance. And you needed a royal warrant, you needed permission from the crown to mine. But the skills of metalworking were very much in advance with some of the German mining companies compared to the UK. And it was the German companies that came over with a royal warrant to mine for things like copper in Cumbria. And the diaries were sent between their representative in Cumbria and the German parent company between the dates of 1564 and 1577. And then remarkably, a chap who worked at the museum, I think at Kendal, in the early 1900s, spent much of his time translating them from German into English and then getting them published. And this gives things like carriage by pack horse of peat fuel. So they're actually talking about how many people were employed, how much was paid, how much peat was being used. They talk about their technology, the sort of uses that this peat was being put to. And what we see in Cumbria is mirrored in many other parts of the country, because we had a lot of industrial exploitation of woodlands, and the woodlands are either exhausted, which is what happened with the lead working around the Eastern Peat district, around Matlock and those places. They just ran out of wood to smelt the metal, or the woodlands were protected for other purposes, so you hadn't got access to them. And what they were using was peat for the metal smelting. And if you look at the mosses and flanks of great mountains like Skiddaw, we see evidence of the huge amount of peat that's been removed. What this gives us is a snapshot, which is a more or less minimum estimate of much greater exploitation. So there's Skiddaw, and basically it's been completely scalped. There is very little peat left in that landscape. And once we start to look at the figures, we get some idea of how much peat is being removed. So if you go around Coniston, which many of you will be familiar with, what happens again, woodland produce became valuable, it became scarce, or it was protected from the 1400s onwards. So peat fuel is then used continually from local turberies from the 15th to the early 19th century. And that only ends when the Lancaster Canal brings cheap coal to the valley. We see the same in mid Wales, where we have accounts of the peat turberies in the valley bottom being exhausted, and then each farmstead and each location, each village having a trackway zigzagging up the hill up onto the top, and they're bringing peat down. And that ends in the 1800s when the railway arrives bearing nutty slack from South Wales. And famous peat fires, such as at Lawson Park Farm in Cumbria, reputedly burnt continuously for over a century. The fire never went out. The fire, because you hadn't got easy matches as we have today, the fire was damped down. That term comes from a peat fire. And you damped it down with a moist turf. So at the end of the evening, you put a moist turf on top of the fire, and the fire didn't go out, it just is subdued. And the next day you can reignite it. The peats are transported from the moss and the drying grounds to the house or cottage. About 7,000 peat turfs heated a modest cottage for a year. This varies, and I'll show some examples. This varies depending on where you are in the country. So it's carried in loads of about 1,000 to a storage barn or a stack near the dwelling. Peats were brought in for burning in pairs, and actually drying the peat properly is really important to this. Each was split in half and then burnt with wood, preferably ash. And cottagers also had peat bellows to restart a damp fire. I've been trying to acquire a set of peat bellows. You have to be sure that they are peat bellows and not just ordinary hand bellows, but there are some which are really rather nice. They tend to be quite expensive, and I think my wife is on the case to make sure I don't buy any. I would like to go. I've got a very extensive collection of peat spades, by the way, but they are very difficult to smuggle into the house. Everything is used. It's like the family pig. Everything's used apart from the squeak. The fireplace had ash pits cleaned out each week as garden fertilizer. In the Scottish crofts, the peat is burnt. You get the peat reek and the smoke, which keeps the mosquitoes down and the midges down. But also the nutrients are trapped in the turf thatch of the cottage, and every few years they are put back onto the land as fertilizer. In a pre-petrochemical landscape where you don't have access to artificial fertilizer, this becomes a matter of life or death. This actually maintains the fertility in an infield outfield type farming situation. So everything is used, and we have to kind of get ourselves into that mindset of how important local usage in the environment was and how important local adaptation is. And you can get an idea, even though these practices have long since died out, you can still see the peat dikes or the tracks. You can find them on old maps, and you can actually see them in the landscape. Once you get your eye in, if you drive through places like North Wales or Mid Wales or Cumbria or the Pennines, you will see these zigzag tracks ending blindly up on the hill. They are your peat dikes, peat tracks. This is a lovely example from a Yorkshire book, a book of illustrations of Yorkshire occupations, and you can see the peat digger, you can see the ruckles or rooks of peat there, you can see his spades, you can see his peat barrow, and you can see the peat cart with that lovely wooden wheel. So peat carries at Langstrathdale in North Yorkshire. So going back to the industrial stuff, 16th century, 20 weeks operation as a Coniston smelting site, there were 4,800 horse loads of peat costing £60. June 1569, Keswick Smelters paid £214, 12 shillings and 9 pence for peat carriage. There's payment for stacking peat and measuring peat and for work at the peat stacks. This is all in the diaries. And he talks about paying for a man with a horse to gather sods, to cover the peat stacks, to protect. I mean, you all know what Cumbria is like in terms of rain. So you're trying to dry the peat, you have to cover the peat stacks with sods. We can also learn a lot of the things I'm interested in, our oral tradition. So a lot of it isn't written down in detail. So the accounts are interesting because they're dealing with money. That's what they're accounting for. They're dealing with money, with amounts, and they're dealing with the metal process, the smelting. They're not dealing with the techniques of managing the peat turbary, how it is cut, how the top is sliced off, put to one side, then put back on the cut over surface. But we can get an idea by looking at the people involved in the operations in photographs and other illustrations. And incidentally, I mean, you will all be familiar with the Cumberland sausage. And that's a bit of heritage, culinary heritage, derived from these very people that came over to smelt the metal and to work the peat bogs, because the Germans wanted a spicy sausage, not the bland English stuff. So they purpose designed the Cumberland sausage. September 1569, Christopher Mason bringing 7,200 loads at 120 the 100 and was paid £6, 6 shillings, 1.5 pence. 1573, £221, 6 shillings and 8 pence for peat delivered. 1584, about 1,000 loads of peat at £16 and something. 1575, Carl Moss, over 3 years, 43,400 loads of peat, 1 shilling the 1,000, £2, 3 shillings and 4 pence. The amounts are huge, they are colossal. And this is why you go in the landscape now and there's no peat, because for all those centuries, they were cutting it. Now, some of this exploitation of peat is on a massive industrial scale. You can see the machinery there digging deep into that peat moss. Like I said with Thorn Moors, the peat was maybe 20 or 30 feet deep in the middle. Look at the depth of peat that they're digging out there. Absolutely colossal. And in some cases, they actually built entire railway systems. We heard about the peat locomotives, but there are also narrow gauge railways which were used in Europe and up to the 1970s, 80s in the UK. Peat railway aficionados get very excited about peat railways. And there you can see they're actually laying out a small railway track and then running engines from a static engine. They're running the wagons along those tracks. It's on a massive scale. And there you've got a machine for mechanically drawing up the peat from that surface. I've got examples in France, people using deep peat extraction hand tools to go down several meters into wet peat. And in Holland, parts of France, they just shoveled the peat out and it was drying on the banks. And then they paid women to form the peat turf by hand out of the wet peat that had been dug out. The Romans actually commented on this when they arrived in the Low Countries, nearly well, probably over 1,500 years ago, nearly 2,000 years ago. And Pliny wrote about how strange it was that these people burned the very earth that they forged with their hands. So they're making handmade peat briquettes and then burning it. And the Romans couldn't understand, these people are burning soil, they're burning mud, what's going on? And some of these machines are incredibly sophisticated. And this kind of moves up to the sort of machinery which we saw towards the latter end of the 20th century, just taking an entire landscape and destroying it completely, harvesting it. And there's a huge difference between a small domestic turbary and modern industrial exploitation. Here you're draining the moss, you're turning it into a fine tilth at the surface, and then you're extracting it mechanically. Very destructive. And we have evidence right on the doorstep. There's a wonderful series which some of you may have seen on the archaeology of, I think it's of northwest England. There's about 7 volumes produced, including ones on Cheshire and Lancashire and on Greater Manchester. And it documents the peat mosses. And of course, Moss Side was the settlement at the side of the peat moss. And Manchester famously had quite a number of major peat mosses, which to some extent are still there in the sediments if they remain. But there's some wonderful accounts of bog bursts in the 1700s, where the peat bog had actually kind of grown through the Little Ice Age to be unstable, and then peat cutting completely destabilized it. And then usually at night, there was a bog burst, and some of these are catalogued in the Manchester newspapers, running 20 or more miles through the landscape, taking everything with it, villagers, buildings, livestock, sometimes people. Absolutely amazing. But there you've got the industrial end of that, and I presume this is using peat from the Lancashire peat mosses. This is the peat gas generator in Manchester. So we're talking about big industrial scale. The machine here from Newport, Monmouthshire, is a peat compressor for making compressed peat blocks. So huge industrial scale. Most of it pioneered by the Germans and sometimes in Poland, where there were huge peat resources. And then people over here were trying to mimic and to copy what the German technology was doing. But domestic consumption was also incredibly important. So again, Torver near Coniston in Cumbria, and up to the 1920s, local people still used peat rather than coal, which was increasingly available. But because you have to pay for coal, peat is often there free for the taking. It's just the effort in actually dealing with it. What sometimes happens is that common rights to peat lapse, and then the landowner will actually allow commercial peat exploitation. And the later domestic exploitation is often people selling peat from the back of a lorry door to door, or from a local peat market. But originally it would have been your common right to take it from the local turbary, and you would have been precluded from selling it commercially. I even in the 1980s had somebody selling, if you can believe this, selling peat for fires in Barnsley, which, taking coals to Newcastle, I don't know, it's trying to sell peat in a coal mining area was a little bit rich. And I think that came from Home Moss in the Peat District. So it's brought down by cart or by sled, so a vehicle without wheels, so just metal sliders for the rough terrain, stacked in the peat house. It's free or it's cheap. And as I said earlier, the amount that you need varies depending on where you are, depends on the climate. So Cornish Farm might burn about 1,000 turfs annually. It's quite a warm climate. But occupied for 300 years, then you've got 300,000 turfs. That's a lot of peat, a lot of carbon. And we know for different areas the approximate measurements, but these were often controlled very strictly, and the type of tool and the design of the tool used to exploit the peat was very important, because you had to comply with the required measurements. But that's about 4,200 cubic meters. North Yorkshire, North Gill Farm, Farndale, I do a lot of work in Farndale. It's a bitterly cold place in winter. They were using about 17,500 turfs a year. And again, we have the dimensions of those. So 300 years, that's a 1 meter depth area of peat, about 400 meters by 100 meters, 40,000 cubic meters. And you know, I've done some calculations which are on my website. There's an article about the scale of domestic peat exploitation. This has to be put into the context of the global peat resource. Global peatlands, as we heard, hugely important for carbon. About 500 gigatons of carbon, twice the capacity of forests. But the research we've been doing, the historical research, the cultural research, shows that domestic burning of peat was on a vast scale. We've not been able to calculate it precisely because we did put in some bids with colleagues at York and other universities to actually do this using computer mapping and try and reinstate where we thought peat was in the landscape. But we didn't get the funding to do that. We were told it wasn't significant research. Climate change and carbon, but never mind. What we do know is that Liverpool was formed and founded on peat mosses. Kendal was fueled by peat. Carlisle was fueled by peat from the Solway mosses and the Pennines. York was fueled by peat back to the Romans. And in the medieval times, they were importing peat from Thorne Moors near Doncaster. And we know this because we've actually got the accounts of people being fined, vendors being fined for selling peat from Thorne at the wrong price on the streets of York. And we know what they were fined and when it was blah, because they weren't selling at the right price. Cambridge and the Cambridge colleges were fueled by peat. A lot of Greater Manchester was fueled by peat. Southampton was fueled by peat. Even Leeds, I've got people with Turberry records in Leeds. And when the Sheffield Commons were enclosed in what's now the city centre of Sheffield, there were complaints about the loss of peat Turberry rights. Now, what this leads to, just to draw some of the presentation to a close, the scale and timing of domestic peat use is significantly misunderstood. It's much greater and much earlier. And a lot of it is pre-industrial. And it's often in places where the history tells you and topography can tell you that there are peatlands there. But there's no peatlands recognised today, and nobody has noticed that they were there because they've not been there for maybe 300 or 400 years. But look at the records, look at the archives, and we know that they were there. Look at the field patterns. You can see the evidence in the archaeology of the peat being there. Now, all that peat has gone, all that is carbon dioxide. And we think that this is probably an unrecognized climate change trigger. It occurs before the industrial release of carbon dioxide. It's very early stuff. Some of the things in the Peat District have more peat removed from the dark peak of the Peat District than the Norfolk Broads at the same time in the 14 and 1500s. It's just not been noticed. But the archaeology tells us that it's there. It's been done pre-1600, probably pre-1500. And it's on a massive scale. Bearing in mind that the Norfolk Broads, up to the 1950s, were believed to be an intact wilderness area in terms of their ecology. And then some really amazing work was done that showed that actually the Norfolk Broads are a flooded medieval peat cut, or series of peat cuts. And we have the detailed archives showing the supply of peat fuel into Norwich and the ecclesiastical centres there on a huge scale. So that is pretty, when we kind of realised all this, which is this cross-disciplinary work coming together, it was quite a moment. And then some of it is a bit negative because you think, whoa, this was a fantastic resource, but it's almost totally gone. However, it may mean, and this was part of the research proposal that we were going to develop, it may mean that there is potential for much greater recovery and carbon capture than previously thought. because we're not just dealing with the loss of the peatlands that we knew about, we're dealing with peatlands in the landscape on a much wider, much broader scale. Now that applies to the United Kingdom or Great Britain and Ireland, but it also applies across much of Western Europe and Northern Europe. So there is a potential to start to address some of the climate and carbon issues on a much wider scale than hitherto believed. So just to bring things to a bit of a conclusion, John mentioned this book earlier. If you are interested in that, it's a much reduced price on my website, because I have a number of copies at a discount price. So please don't buy it from other booksellers. Go onto my online website and there are details of that. And it is much cheaper there. But that was kind of bringing together a lot of these issues and ideas. Peat has been influenced by human population levels and industrial importance in the early industrial period. Peat fuel was hugely, hugely important in a way that we simply do not appreciate. You have to put yourself into that landscape, into that time, and we can't do it. David Lowenthal, wonderful American academic, wrote a book called The Past is a Foreign Country. And by that he means that we can't, it smelled differently, it sounded different, it looked different, they talk a different language. You have to immerse yourself in the past in order to understand how people related to their environment. And that's especially so in terms of the peatlands. These are fundamental to many local communities, and most of those communities have been completely forgotten. So the utilization was commercial and industrial, it was domestic, and it was often triggered by exhaustion or protection of wood fuel supplies. Why didn't they use coal? And I've had not heated, but interesting academic debates with very eminent colleagues about fuel use and the history of fuel. And everyone thinks that people used wood and then they used coal. Well, coal is difficult because of access and transport. It's also difficult because a lot of raw coal is pretty unpleasant to burn, and you can't burn it in primitive cottages that most people lived in. Most buildings until about 1500 didn't have a chimney, didn't have a proper fireplace. If you try burning coal in that situation, it's A, very unpleasant, and B, potentially very dangerous. You poison yourself. You get carbon monoxide poisoning. So there are issues there. Also, you have to pay for coal. It's a prestigious fuel. It's only used by the rich. The very rich, the very affluent, for cooking and heating, use charcoal, because charcoal is a pure, steady heat. That's why it's better for smelting and things like that. So there are all sorts of issues as to why we didn't use coal, why most people in the medieval period, I think, used peat turf. That might be deep peat, or it might even be, if you haven't got deep peat, you skimmed off the surface and you burnt the soil and the plant roots and the lower part of your vegetation. And if you couldn't afford that, you burnt animal dung, which is still done in Africa and India. Peat and peat usage are global issues. These are amazing resources. We are still discovering in the tropics vast areas of peat deposition, which are quite clearly fundamental to many, many aspects of biodiversity, of indigenous communities, and in terms of climate change and climate buffering. And yet we carry on blithely as though nothing's wrong. I've had arguments with people who claim that palm oil plantations are a sustainable forestry use of tropical forest areas. They are hugely detrimental. Local tribes are being forced into extinction, or they're being Disneyfied and absorbed into other cultures. And some of these landscapes are burning. And you're talking about 8,000 or 10,000 years of peat accumulation going up in smoke. And palm oil has got into almost everything in the food supply chain. So we are directly responsible for this happening. And the people out there is a little clip which Jack Riley gave me, very eminent professor of peat bogs and tropical peatlands. If you go onto my blog, you can probably find it, but it's pretty horrific stuff, where a group are begging for help to stop the fires in their peat forests. And they kind of say, you know, we're a handful of rangers in the forest. We have no resource. We cannot control these fires that are being deliberately started. Please help. Dreadful stuff. So one thing is that we need to reconnect people to their peatlands, and projects like Moors for the Future and the Yorkshire Peat Partnership and the Cumbria Bog Life that I was on the steering committee for, hugely, hugely important. And of course, your own sites in your own area. So what you are doing is absolutely fantastic. It's absolutely central to the future. We have to safeguard what's left, and we have to restore what's been lost. But part of the message here is that we've lost a lot more than we thought we got, if you follow the logic behind that. Thank you very much for listening. There's my research website that has a link to the bookshop and stuff, but I've also sent the links to the organisers for that. There's also my blog, Ian's Walk on the Wild Side. If you just put peat into that, you'll find all sorts of goodies. And then there's also my Twitter handle at Ian the Wild Side. So please follow that. And when I do something on peat, please like it and retweet it. There's an ongoing issue that I've been involved with some of the peat producers because of a documentary I did with ITN a couple of years ago. And they then approached me to get guidance on going peat free, which we've all been advocating, because everyone in the room who's bought plants from garden centres contributed to this situation, including me. But they approached me to give them guidance on going peat free and on to restoring quite a number of their presently cut over peat bogs. But I have found them incredibly difficult to work with. And at the point I'm stepping back from that liaison and coordination very reluctantly, and getting back on the campaign trail again to try and halt this hugely damaging exploitation, which simply should not be allowed. One of the aspects of peat bogs, which is often not mentioned, and Paul Buckland would be on my case if I didn't mention it, is that the layers of the peat, which are dug out, even if we can restore the sphagnum bog, the layers of the peat represent an irreplaceable heritage and archaeological resource in themselves. Thorn moors are areas of bog oaks, not necessarily oaks, but they're just called bog oaks, dragged out by farmers from the peat bog. And in the United States, this will be a national monument for fossil trees. Here, they just get winched out of the bog and then burned. We really don't know with the damage that we're doing. It's absolutely appalling. And on that cheerful note, thank you very, very much.
Ian, thank you. And again, if you can manage to stop screen sharing, that would perhaps help. But nevertheless, we will hand over again to Pippa, who becomes manager of the questions. Pippa, okay. What have you got in your inbox at the moment?
Oh, I've got some contentious ones from somebody called Anon, but we'll come to those anon. Okay. We've got two historical questions that I'll put together. One from Jill saying, are there any Indigenous people who use sphagnum for babies' nappies?
Yes,
then,
yes, there are.
Thank you. And then Ian asks, are there still peat-fired power stations in the Republic of Ireland?
I think the industrial exploitation is really fascinating because it's, on the one hand, it's very damaging, but there's also a history which is very important to those communities. It's a bit like the coalfields areas, which are, my own patch is a coalfields area, and there's a cultural depth to the people that actually lived and worked for generations in those landscapes. And this, we've found the same thing with peat, and we've interviewed people, and we've got people's personal stories. I was involved in doing some closing events for the Cumbria Bog Life project, and we stayed at a farm on the Solway Moss, and it turned out that the farmer, quite an elderly chap, his family for generations had been peat cutters on the Solway, and no one had ever talked to him. No one had ever asked him a question about it. So we had a really fascinating time talking about what it was like, and the young men on the peat moss smoking in pipes, smoking peat. Well, if you think Marlborough or Capstan or whatever it is rough, then smoking raw peat is really rather grim sort of stuff. But there's all sorts of cultural things which are really interesting. And we had a speaker from Bord na Mona, the Irish peat industry, talk about the bog villages that they set up, a bit like in South Yorkshire. We have white city estates, which were built for the miners coming up from South Wales and down from Tyneside and Scotland to work in the Yorkshire coalfield. And they had the bog villages, which they built for the bog workers for industry. So there's all that, and you can't blame those people for their role in this, but hugely damaging by the end of the 20th century. I think they've stopped it. I think they have. And also, I think partly as a result of the ITN documentary I was involved in, the Irish government banned the export of horticultural peat. So we are starting to make some real inroads. The UK government has promised to ban the sale of horticultural peat, and they banned it with a voluntary ban. I think it's finished in like 2010, and obviously it didn't finish. And then it was definitely going to end by 2021. It's still not finished. And now they're definitely really going to ban it by something like 2030. But I think the government are trying to fast track that, because as John said at the outset, people have suddenly realized how much carbon is actually stored in peat. It is a huge amount. And there's two sources which obviously, we take, peat has been taken, it's disguised in planters and plants that we buy at a garden centre, as well as the big sacks of peat that you buy. And the challenge for the industry is getting enough good quality fibre to produce a good peat-free compost. They can now produce a good peat-free compost. They can't produce enough of it, which seems to be a big issue. So that is part of the challenge that they've got. But I think we are making some headway, but it's slower than you would want. Yeah.
I can see John's got his hand up, but I'll just finish the questions that are in the chat first, if that's all right, John.
Yeah.
I've got two peat cutting questions. Pauline's asking, what's the relative percentage of peat cut in the UK? What percentage is used in gardens and what percentage is used for other things? And then my controversial friend Anon says, are there any circumstances where a return to peat cutting in the UK might be justified, e.g. because of the cost of fossil fuels?
Yeah, interesting questions. In terms of the amounts in the UK, very little is now used for fuel. If you were there in the 1970s, I've talked to people who were in, say, Wales, in Bangor, at Bangor University, and they remembered the peat smell in the village, and you get the smoke, and it was peat, the peat reek. I know people in Somerset who told me about burning peat in the 1960s, 1970s. There is some burnt in Scotland, in the Western Isles, and peat is used for one of my favourite products, sadly, malt whiskey. So that's quite a big usage, commercial usage. And I think, the whiskey industry is waking up to the fact that they need to regenerate the peat if they're going to carry on using it. And there's a problem. If you take the incomers to the west of Scotland, for example, they inherit a bit of peat turbary, but they don't inherit the skills of cutting it. And what you do if you cut it, you cut the top off, you put the top to one side, you then cut down, and then you cut in, and you remove certain, standard sized briquettes, which are then taken, processed by kids and women, taken to the peat drying grounds, and then turned after a few weeks and dried, then put into a rickle or ruckle, and then eventually taken down to the peat storage area. And then you put the cut surface back onto the cut over bog, so it regenerates. What people do now is they go up with a load of plastic sacks, shovel it into the bag, and then take it. And that is hugely damaging. What they do in Ireland is that people were actually using a machine that actually drills under the peat bog and takes it out almost commercially as like a sausage under the peat, and that's also very damaging. So that is a big problem, but not much is used now for heat. We have one cultural well, no, we've got two turberies in the Peak and the South Pennines, one at Home Moss, which is a fascinating site. And actually, I am quite okay about that continuing because it's living history. But if you have a hearth, a house with a hearth in the village of Home, you can register your rights to cut peat on the peat turberry for your domestic usage. A lot of Home Moss was wasted, it was cut over, but that was actually, that wasn't the domestic turberries, that was two guys that were discharged after the Second World War. They got the £25, a suit of clothes and a suitcase, and they bought a van, a lorry, and they set up a little peat works on Home Moss, and they stripped an entire side of the hillside and sold peat. During the energy crisis, the post-war energy crisis, they sold it to factories in Sheffield, Leeds, Bradford, Barnsley, etc. And over on the other side of the Pennines, the Pilkington glass people stripped a whole load of the west-facing flanks of the Pennines. At the same time, there's a fuel crisis. There's not much fuel left now. The bulk of the peat usage has been for horticulture, and simply importing peat from overseas is also hugely damaging and unacceptable. We need to be working towards totally peat-free but good quality compost. So that was, I think that was, there was another question, wasn't there, about...
Would there ever be any justification for returning to peat cutting if the cost of fossil fuels got too great and people were suffering as a result?
This has happened in some areas, and it started probably 5-10 years ago. I had one or two people inquiring about it, and they were mostly linked to existing places where there was an extant peat turberry. So you have a turberry is a place where you can cut peat, and you have the right to cut the peat. So only certain people can do it. You can't go up onto the moors and cut peat because it's somebody else's land, it's somebody else's peat. So you have to have a right. Those rights are historic, and once they're extinguished, they are not reinstated. And it used to be believed that the peat rights were actually tied to the actual hearth of the building, the farm or the cottage where you lived. And the peat turberry rights were linked to that, which is why sometimes you find a more modern farmhouse, but the chimney stack and the hearth of an old farm building or cottage left in situ. Because if you knock that down, you lost your peat turberry rights. I mean, when I would say that, I think I don't have a problem with small scale domestic cutting where it's part of a living history, because it is this connection to the past, and it's not the same as the industrial scale. Now, some of my colleagues would disagree, but it's not the same as we had in the 1980s of Fisons hoovering up vast areas of Thurle Moors with major industrial machinery. And a few guys in the Highlands of Scotland cutting a peat fire, I don't have a problem with that, but you do it in a way which allows the peat to regenerate, and that's the problem. And it's a bit weird because no one really is showing that much. There's a small group of us who are interested in this. It's a very exclusive club, and we occasionally get together and share each other's peat spades and things like that. But it is, the knowledge has been lost. The knowledge of how to do it properly and sustainably has been lost. And I mean, I've been greeted at meetings by people from the Western Isles or from Ireland, and they say, "Oh, it's Ian, you're the one that knows about peat cutting." Which is, I mean, it really is Colston, Newcastle. You know, someone from Ireland telling me that I'm the expert on peat cutting. But hey.
Great. I'm just aware of the time, so I think if we go over to John, and then Anna Gilchrist has got a question, and then we'll see if we can. I think some of the other questions have already been answered, but if we go to John first and then Anna, and then see how we're doing. So John, what's your question?
Well, thank you very much, Ian, for that. It's wonderful. But I just want, people may not realize quite how immensely relevant what Ian was saying is to our local area. So, for example, on Burdett's map of 1782, we see very little in the way of woodland. We see things called lifeless moss, shadow moss. These are mosses which the medievals have completely worked out, and they do leave a shadow still in the modern landscape, because you can see the pattern of moss rooms and things like that, which was the way in which the peat cutting was being regulated. And then Ian said that we need to know where these worked out areas are, because there is real potential for re-establishing new wetlands. And on November the 10th, we've got a group of people coming together to talk about establishing a Lindo Moss partnership for the wider Lindo Moss landscape. So the cutover peat bog is 28 hectares. The wider Lindo Moss landscape is 1,740 hectares. And there are great hollows in that landscape. For instance, between the Plough and Flail pub, if you look from the back garden of that across to Moss Road in Mobley, there's a massive hollow in front of you. That was once a peat bog, just like Lindo Moss. The peat has been taken out completely. And if you core it, there is just a few centimeters of organic soil, and then you're into the blue lake clay of the post-glacial lake. It's exactly as Ian described, but that has got enormous potential for re-establishing a new wetland community in there and in many other situations in that 1,700 hectares. So it was really inspirational to hear about that, and so relevant to our local area.
I mean, once you get your eye in, you see the evidence of peat cutting. It's a bit like I do work on woodlands and charcoal burning, and you suddenly get your eye in, you can spot these things. If you stop at the Cat and Fiddle pub, which many of you will know, and look on the road opposite, it's all a peat cut. It's all a peat turbary for a peat fire in the pub. One of the things to bear in mind is that there's been very little detailed recording of some of the older peat cuttings, which are really interesting, and particularly their archaeology. And I know we talked about this with the Cumbria Bog Life project, that there ought to be some examples where we can actually do some proper interpretation of these former landscapes, because Oliver Rackham, when we showed this to him, reckoned it was the equivalent of his medieval woodlands for the uplands, that these peat cuttings, which sometimes go back to the Romans, really, really important, but they're completely overlooked. So that's something, again, to bear in mind, that they often are not really noticed. And the only other person who has really looked at this is, again, this is my Sheffield geography, but not that far from you, is Fens and Wixle Moss.
Yep.
And Andre Berry did some fantastic work on there and produced a wonderful book about the history of the peat use and the peat turbary on there. And he is one of this group of very sad people who collect peat spades like myself, you see. So
Brilliant. Anna, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Pippa. Ian, thank you so much. That was such a fascinating talk. And I am bursting with questions, and I wasn't quite sure which way to go, whether to go into the past and cultural heritage or go into the future. So I've plunked for the future, but I might have to email you because it was so fascinating. Anyway,
yeah, feel free. That's not a problem.
So there's currently a lot of interest in the UK, both government and NGOs and everybody else, it seems, about rewilding, particularly in the uplands. And I just wondered, I know you spoke about Ringinglow as a really interesting example, but I just wondered, I suppose the general perspective is that we can't just leave degraded bogs, and that they just won't amount to anything. And I just wondered, based on your extensive knowledge, what would happen if we just left a degraded bog? Would it restore to an active bog, or would it scrub up? Or is that really site dependent and it varies? Or do we not know?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. We've actually got a PhD student at the moment, one of my former master's students who did an MSc dissertation with me on sphagnum recovery, on the Most for the Future sites, on some stuff in North Wales and on Ringinglow Bog. So we are looking at this and comparing what happens when you intervene and what happens if you don't intervene. So she's now partway through a PhD looking at some of this. And I think it depends. Ringinglow is not as badly affected as the more northerly bits of the most for the future landscape. So basically, remove the pollution, keep the water level up, stop overgrazing it. It's not rocket science. What we are showing is the sites have huge powers of recovery. I mean, absolutely mind-blowing compared to what I would see there, say in the 1980s when I was city ecologist in Sheffield. That site is almost unrecognizable. It is just fantastic to see that. If you've got a site like the most for the future areas, further into the northern dark peak, then they are more polluted, they are very exposed. It's going to be very, very difficult to get things established. And my dear friend Penny Anderson did a lot of work with Rob Mars at Liverpool on restoring degraded upland blanket mire systems. So to some extent, you probably have to intervene. The question is, how much do you intervene? That's the $50 million question. And you can either intervene by just, I mean, they've added things like lime to get rid of the extreme acid rain effect. They've put in bunds to hold back the erosion water. You still have on those high sites, you still have problems of frost heave, which disrupts the vegetation from establishing because they're such extreme environments. So I think in those circumstances, you probably need to intervene. And then you've got a question, do you use plant fragments? Do you use plug plants? Do you use clones? Do you use beader moss? There's 1,000,001 different approaches. And also, which species do you use? So some of this, hopefully, we'll have more answers when my PhD students are finished. But it's kind of looking at your site as an individual site. If you're in Cumbria or north of Morecambe Bay, if you're in North Wales, you stand back and things are going to happen. It will happen very, very quickly, far faster than I think people believed. If you are on the top of Kinder Scout, like that picture I showed at the start, don't hold your breath, because if you don't intervene, you're not going to get any recovery. And that means that we are then actively losing carbon from the peat there. The other source I didn't mention was that in the lowlands, we're still not really sure what we do about some of the former fenlands, which are now breadbasket landscapes, and they are hemorrhaging carbon like there's no tomorrow. You know, we know from things like the home post in Woodwalton Fen, how many meters of peat have gone since the 1850s. But we seem at the moment incapable of doing anything much about it. Because again, there really the answer is probably water, holding back the water level and re-wetting the sites. So I think it's really taking each site on a case-by-case basis. As an ecologist, I tend to prefer a less heavy intervention. I think if you can find sites that will recover naturally, that is actually far more valuable. I wrote a little book called Shadow Woods, which you might be interested in, which is to do with a lot of the upland landscapes in particular. We believe in the past had a lot of wet willow habitat before they were drained. Bearing in mind, like the Peak and Pennines, the moorland areas and the blanket bog areas have had 200 years of drainage, intensive grazing and burning. And that gives us what we see today. So you have to try and get back to what it was like before that. And a lot of it was actually not the open single species or very limited species mixes of heather moorland. It was what we call a shadow wood, and it was probably wooded common. So certainly up to not the very high ground, but up the flanks of the hills was quite open woody vegetation with heathland. More heath as you go up, more woody as you go down. And some of these sites that we're finding quite out on the edge of the upland areas are the most fantastic bluebell sites you could possibly imagine. And nobody's recognized them. These are my scrub habitats. No one thinks scrub is anything important. It's the most fantastic habitat you can find. And we've got evidence now that a lot of these upland areas were in fact wooded common with more trees, but often quite small trees, until probably the 1700s. So yeah, we're still discovering it. It's still, you know, there's still more stuff emerging. But when you go onto a site that you knew as a degraded site and it's recovering, it is very, very special. And what we're hoping then is, if you look at the sphagnum mosses, all mosses are great, but not all mosses are equal. Some are ones that just cover a wet surface. Some are ones that actively build peat. And there's a handful of the peat builders, and they are the ones which are the most sensitive to pollution. I have to say, I always blame the air pollution in the Peat District on Manchester because the winds come from the west. So that's just a Sheffield perspective. But the real bog builders don't like air pollution. And those are the ones that we're now looking to see, are they coming back? And they are coming back in smaller amounts. But 5 years, it's transformed. It is looking really, really exciting. And there's been no intervention at all. But having said that, someone said that they'd driven past Ringing Low Bog. Imagine that landscape as it was in 1500 or 1600. That landscape extended right the way down into Sheffield city centre as a seamless tract. Crooks Moor, which is where Sheffield University is, some of you will know, was a moorland, and I have a plant list taken by a very eminent botanist at the time in the 1700s that it extended right the way down as heathland and moorland and probably bog, right the way down into Sheffield. That's what we've lost.
Wow, gosh.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to hand over to Stuart for a final, very topical question, and then we'll hand over to Helen to wind up for us.
Ian, if I were to offer you a slot at the COP26 conference, what would be your principal argument for defending peatlands?
Defending from horticulture and everything else.
But from all, yes.
Yeah. I think that history tells us what we've done. It tells us what we've lost. We are only now beginning to recognize the scale of the natural catastrophe that we are bringing about. And I say it varies from the ones which I know about and work in Northern Europe, Western Europe and Britain, to the tropical ones. And what we're doing in the tropics is completely unethical and unacceptable. Because when we were damaging the ones on our doorstep, we have the excuse that we didn't really know. They were viewed as intractable, and wastes, and this was an economic purpose. Thorn Moors, and I showed a couple of pictures of it, it's this fantastic site, 7 by 4 miles even today. And in the 1970s, the local authority idea was to landfill the whole lot and then to build an airport on it. That's where we were. That was our view of peat bogs in the 1970s. So we have come a long way, and we have to address this. This is, let's just say, the loss of farming peat soils is a serious, serious issue because it is releasing huge amounts of carbon. Obviously, it's a component of climate change, but these are also sites where there are fewer than probably 30 to 50 years of harvest left. And these are our breadbasket landscapes. And we don't seem to understand the words food security. So the solution there is not to necessarily stop farming in some of these landscapes. They can't be reverted back to peat bogs or the sort of Thorn Moors type uncut peat bog. You can't go rewilding. The of rewilding is a problem. You can't anything. You can wild it and you can be informed by history, but whatever we produce is something in the future. It's going forward. So although I am an advocate of rewilding, the of rewilding is troublesome. But we have to understand what we've done, and then we have to have a vision going forwards which is viable, sustainable and functional. For farmers, that means farming wet landscapes. It's a thing that we call paludiculture, and the Dutch and the Germans are pioneering this. So farmers can then have a viable farming existence in a wetter landscape, and that wetter landscape holds carbon and it prevents flooding.
Well, Ian, that's absolutely fantastic, and thank you so much. I really look forward to the COP26 conference, and we'll see just how much comes out of it that relates to this evening's talk. One of our members who cuts across all the organisations with which I'm acquainted is my friend Helen Batalana, who is another lady who is passionate about the bog in Wilmslow. And I think there's no one more appropriate to have the last say, and thank Ian for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Well, in his introduction, John Hanley told us about your interdisciplinary approach, blending the science with the artistic side of the topic, particularly the cultural history of peatlands. And that's exactly what we've got from you. And your talk has given me a much, much wider perspective about peatlands. And it has made me even more enthusiastic to see the restoration of our own Lindo moss. So Ian, thank you so much for your talk, which I found truly fascinating and illuminating. And I'm sure I speak for all the people who've been behind those 69 screens that have been online this evening. It really has been an important highlight of our Wilmslow Festival of Nature. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for listening. And thank you very much for the invitation. All I would say really is keep up the good work, because a lot of this recovery of peat bogs relies on groups like yourselves. So please, please keep up the good work. Do follow my Twitter, and when I tweet on Peat, please like it and retweet it. I need that.
Do unmute yourselves so that Ian can hear the applause once again. Thank you all, and thank you, Ian, especially, and the others who've taken part. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Stop the recording now.
Thank you.
He couldn't give
Fabulous talk, fabulous, really brilliant.